open source programming languages to build products. We use software tool chains to create for developers that are open source, as well as bringing them in from open source across the ecosystem. The technology we use to develop and to maintain and share to hold up the internet for global networking is mostly open source through global access. And so at the heart of, even at the heart of breakthrough open science and research, we work on collaboratively as and with scientists. As much as possible, we share that through open source and openly available licenses and at least open access information. So after 26 years, we're fortunate enough that open source as a part of Google is so deep that we don't have to sell bringing it in to Google. We don't have to sell Google open source. Instead, our team and colleagues have the challenge of focusing on where and how we can uniquely contribute to a Google scale mission with the resources that we are accountable for. So this is where you've heard a lot of folks talk about impact today. So I'm actually going to get a little bit more detailed around when we talk about impact, what that entails and means. So one of the most critical parts of my job, like everyone here, is evolving my work and our team to meet the changes, challenges, and demands of the business today. And to do that, I have to continually address the needs and value of our work with open source and the impact this work demonstrates to Google leadership. So one of the reasons we do this is because this is essential as a part of our business, but it's also essential as a part of our work to be able to explain folks where we fit in the organization and why that organization is important as part of the larger piece of Google. And so I hear the challenges that we face, and echoed across other industry peers, is that measuring our impact across such a wide technology ecosystem can be near impossible. But we have found that as with organizations with technical systems evolve, that we can also evolve that as a supporting and adjacent team, as well as one critical to some of these technical systems. So if your organization is faced with challenges, like creating a common strategy for different licenses, which may impact your intellectual property plans, or making sure folks in your teams know who to ask questions when they want to know what the rules are, it's helpful to have sometimes some common structures or common maps for folks to be able to do that. And so you can have policies or strategies or guidance that's not centralized, but the challenge is that when you start working in complex team structures, much of that institutional knowledge kind of gets dispersed and goes away, and you really do benefit from some common practices across your teams. So one of the ways that we have done this, and we find this to be helpful at Google, is by having an OSPO. So OSPOs, if you missed it earlier, there was a lovely talk that was kind of an introduction to Open Source Programs Office. I highly recommend it, Dwayne O'Brien. So I won't go over everything there, but I will say if you missed that one, Open Source Programs Offices, commonly referred to as OSPOs, they form to meet the needs of an organization and evolve as those needs change over time. So there's many reasons here of what OSPOs can focus on. I tend to ask folks if they say they work at an OSPO, I ask them what flavor they are, because I want to know what kind of problems they're trying to do and what they're focusing on. Also because I want to understand what an organization specifically needs. Because there's a tendency when forming a new organization to look at someone else's and say, we'll just do it like that, without understanding why that was formed to begin with or what it's challenging to do now. So with that, I will say, we are called the Open Source Programs Office, but that's not the only P that we deal with. So if you're considering a fork of an existing structure or mission of another OSPO, another organization, I would recommend you look at the kind of P that you deal with. My team hears me talk about this all the time. We don't just work on programs anymore. We work on projects and policy and policies. We work on progress, we work on processes, we work on products and problems, and I wish pie more often, but sometimes pie. So the rest of the work, the rest of this talk, I will focus on the work that our OSPO does, and I will also recognize that may or may not be the work that your OSPO needs or your OSPO does, or even if you need an OSPO. So think about this more as a centralized way of organizing open source at a large-scale business. If you came here for a different talk or you wanted different information, you get up and go to get a cup of tea, I will not judge you. It's completely fine. Other folks, when they talk about enterprise, I'm sure, are looking maybe for different information. It's okay, I realize there's a little bit of a mismatch. So, again, we're gonna talk a bit about this big kind of question of like when we say that we're gonna bring all the value of open source to Google and all the resources of Google open source, what does that mean and how do we distill that down? So this is a pretty big concept, right? Google in itself is not small. and also open source in itself, not small. But our team is actually not that large, so we have to figure out what to do with this in a way that is efficient and productive. The way that we do that, starting off from anything else, is figuring out all that we could be doing. What should we be doing? This is a regular practice we have to go through. So we have to know which of the all we focus on and for whom. And with that, to separate out the should from the could, we really have to lean into understanding the expectations of our decision makers, as well as explaining where the value of our strategic initiatives support those decision makers' objectives. It's a lot of matchmaking. To put it simply, we spend a lot of time individually as leaders and engineers and program managers and teams within teams really clarifying what we are working on and why. It's not just all of the fancy CLs and PRs. Okay, so questions that we have to be able to ask about our own open source priorities before we talk about them anywhere else is we really need to understand the why and the how. So we always want to be able to answer a few specific questions for every priority in our portfolio. We need to know why we are doing our work, who we are doing it for, who the stakeholders are that even care about that, as well as what the impact is on our business. We will get into the impact of it. So as for the why, the who, I'm gonna briefly step away from that. Our time is short. I have a much longer, I didn't try to include all of it. It was over 90 slides. It was really not just, you would have all fallen asleep. But if you want to dive deeper into specifics of reviewing tools and frameworks we've developed to help identify who stakeholders are in a company and how to align that to your impact reporting, I have a previous talk. You're welcome to see it. These are the building blocks of information that our teams do work in and for within open source to frame the value of that work for our business partners, communities, and ourselves. So again, I do not have a specific free as in puppy moment. So here's my puppy. There are many like her, but this one is mine. We cannot talk about business priorities at scale without talking about investment management, including how to understand and explain your investments in and around open source. So we're actually halfway through the talk. Excellent. So we're halfway through the talk, and you'll notice I talk about impact, but I don't talk about ROI. That's extremely intentional. ROI, again, like open source, though sometimes used generically, ROI in and of itself is a very specific economic model, which we found to be way too simplistic to capture the complexities of open source ecosystems. So when you talk about ROI, you are talking about direct inputs and direct outputs. It's one-to-one. So if we're trying to explain direct or indirect impact, if we're trying to explain the kinds of complexities that exist around economics of open source that do not go from money in to money out, it means we cannot talk about those network effects, those catalytic effects, those leading and lagging effects that we see with open source in a way that we feel like can be simply expressed through ROI. Now, it's not that you can't use ROI to describe certain aspects of open source, but we find that distilling things down to one number for a specific business unit has never been successful for us. So sweeping generalizations and estimates can be made about first order costs on work like code reviews. So you can estimate equivalent hourly pay and time invested in a review, but it fails to always account for the social and community investment made by the same code reviewer to work with a new committer to onboard them to a project, help track down the bugs, and other sponsorship work which is never captured by those metrics. So like I said, we tend to avoid that in general and specifically unless it does apply to the kind of specific project we are talking about. So our recommendation for that and what we found to be more effective, especially in the language of Google, which I realize does not apply to everybody here, we do talk about business impact usually in input-output models. So we shift more to explaining investments into the larger system, and again, like where we can see those either directly, indirectly, or as some end order output, where that investment is happening, and then creating new things to happen from that. I get very careful about my language around here as well because there's a big difference between being able to say that something is able to be defendable or is merely demonstrable. And if you're in any kind of research, you understand there's a big difference between those two words. Mostly it's the difference between, can I show you scientifically that whether or not something is applicable in this case, or can I kind of wave my hands at it and then we can all feel good about that and move forward. So I try to be in the defensible space, more in the demonstrable phase, but I will recognize there's value in that as well. So this here, again, we're trying to really anchor on like what is defensible. So where can we identify investments and contributions What kind of stories can we show for an organization so we don't throw away qualitative information or like the power of the narrative coming back? And also understanding how stakeholders communicate, measure the world, and identify their own success. And the reason for that is because we have to anchor all of this into some kind of useful metric and what's called a KPI, a key performance indicator. And so it's not as simple for us as querying financial data, but it is that we have to start looking at like where we can measure something, tie that together into the story, and anchor it back to be able to explain why this is actually useful when we're trying to measure what's going on with our business. So sometimes when I talk about metrics, people in developer relations and open source have some very big feelings. So I like to bring these down hopefully to a level that most people in business hopefully feel more calm about, which is that metrics are just measurements. In and of themselves, there's no judgment they should make. They're a decision that you made to be able to record something and then make a decision based off of that. So observations are not unbiased. When we choose what we're going to observe, that we actually choose the lens we're going to observe it through, we choose what to leave out. So those decision biases all bias the outcomes regardless of your intention. Just be clear in how you record those design decisions and be clear about your motives for observing. Think of it like a scientific experiment. Really because you're just collecting data to paint a picture, tell a story, and give insight into all of this. And that's because your ultimate goal is to create something that's useful. I joke around with folks quite frequently that if they're looking for someone to create vanity metrics, I'm very good at that. I can make things look very good. Usually what I try to do is encourage folks to focus on things that are useful, and that means to focus on like you want to make a decision or you want to understand something, then let's focus on working our way back from there. Again, I don't have time to go into all of this specific methodology here. There's like a 5-step process and an explanation into it and applying it to an open source project. If you're interested in that, I gave a talk with Julie Ferrioli on this at FOSS Backstage. Here's another link. Sorry to be all the nested talks. So one example of this we can give as part of our business specifically is you can go onto our blog and look at how we have been changing how we measure contributions and share that with the world over time. So Sophia Vargas, who's unfortunately not here today, is our project lead for this and has been doing this since 2019. So we've been publishing our kind of North Star metrics as well as our methodology for collecting those, running through what is called through GitHub as well as our contributions to what we call Get On Board, which is our self-hosted Git repository. And it's interesting to go through Sophia's methodology and see what's changed. Because it's not only taught us about what's changed about our own values and how we measure things, but it's also about the things we found out about platform effects that we've worked on for both GitHub and Get On Board, which teaches us also about what's value for our business and also what we're seeing that's different. So with that, if you're not familiar with KPIs are a specific kind of metric that measure pulse points that correlate to things, whether or not it's considered successful. Now, who it's successful for is always a good question. When people ask me what is critical, I say it depends what's critical for you. So when someone asks you if something is successful, again, their definition of success may be very different from yours. So it's helpful to know what is successful for the people that you work with, what they consider to be successful, and how they talk about you or talk about the work or want to be able to talk about the work. And again, we're trying to make sure that we can help enable decisions and conversations as well as business decisions. We're not always trying to sway people in our direction, but we're just trying to ensure they have the information that they need. So understanding what defines success for you versus success for your stakeholders, two sides of the same coin, but it may not always have the same outcome. So you want to be able to understand not just your own values and what you want to talk about, but you also need to understand for who you're working with and working for. What are their organizational missions and visions? What are their business goals? Do they have a shared roadmap that you can look at and understand? Do they have any dashboards which they use to track? Is there something you can either move in there, something that you can use to understand again what they care about, and what is the signal that they're going to be looking for to explore metrics of success? So I also just want to encourage that how often and when people measure KPIs depends on how quickly things change, not how often you want them to change. So someone may want you to report on something at a frequency for which change is not occurring. They're going to be very dissatisfied when numbers stay the same. It's important to point out to them and have them understand the rate of change that they're seeking versus the rate of change that's actually occurring. So again, considerations for how and when to measure key performance indicators. Think about things like rate of change. Think about how you're aggregating something so that if someone says audience and you say audience, do you mean the same thing? You want to understand those collection cycles. How often is something going to refresh, and how often should you be observing? Reporting cycles, when to make things public, but also privacy and security risks. So one way I can also give an example of this was I had an interesting project with some of our program leads who at the time were trying to have success metrics across all the programs for all the kinds of events that we were running. We ran into challenges with things like we didn't have data for all the same kind of events. So whether or not we hosted and ran the platform, whether or not another organization hosted it but we gave them money, and then another one where we had nothing to do with it other than writing a kind check. And then there's no information that really came back from that other than the idea that we got a logo placement. So trying to come together and get collective metrics was a really interesting discussion. It also landed us in a really good place where after multiple workshops, many weeks of working together, I wrote a beautiful 7-page analytical report with suggestions. And at the very bottom, there's a summary table of maybe 7 lines. And turns out that's the thing everybody actually wanted was that summary table. So that's what gets used the most now. But I still appreciate the 7-page paper as an output. And so I realized we're running close to time, but one of my jobs as well, which I was asked briefly to speak about, as the lead for open source and AI, again, not the track, just the person, I work really hard at Google to make open source and AI boring. And I say that because I jokingly describe how I focus a lot of my work on understanding and explaining how new technologies fit into current and future problem spaces, as well as how they improve the systems we've already built for our users. So I'd like to focus quickly on walking through a few of how some new breakthroughs fit into our existing knowledge about solving problems with automated systems, and how I parse through those with the promises and reality of working with new AI technologies. If you're expecting something extremely technical, this is not the technical piece. This is me trying to use very common words to explain what is maybe new and kind of challenging for some folks into some very common business terms. So unlike the lawyer who is explaining engineering, I am not a lawyer, I'm an engineer. So I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a cat, but any good lawyer cat gets very fidgety when engineers talk about legal, regulatory, and compliance matters. Since much of open source and open source AI today intersects in these areas, which is happening right next door, please consult your own lawyer cats if you want to really get into specifics about classification and dark matter. So like I said, I'm not a lawyer cat, but I am an engineer. In the way back, I studied control systems engineering, including robotics. So I get very excited about the ways which we can integrate technology into everyday life to solve useful problems. Also, I understand how systems are built. I understand that systems integration are tricky, and building systems which consume resources are a non-trivial challenge for real-world trade-offs. So if it puts me in a different place, before I worked at Google, I was a principal product manager and data scientist at SAP. I worked in teams at Concur. Is anybody here familiar with Concur? Okay. Concur is business travel and expense management software. I will only entertain positive sounds about Concur from the audience because my former colleagues and the engineers deserve all the credit in the world for maintaining the level of service that they do for building and scaling systems which started as shrink-wrap desktop software. So they have done the migration and the movement for years from desktop software to network systems to its own hosting on-prem to cloud, and I don't even know where they're at right now. It was extremely educational for me, especially to understand meeting the needs of customers with different values and needs. And so my approach to AI is hopefully being a voice of reason, grounded in that global and pragmatic lens, who has built and deployed systems which touch people's lives while trying not to break either the people or the systems they touch. So again, very quickly, I realize I'm running even more short. So when I say what is an AI, most people at VAs, when they talk about AI, they talk about things that are very scary or are talking back at you. Generally, this falls in this idea of generative AI. Generative AI are what's caused a field called neural networks, which was once deep learning, which was once machine learning, which was honestly the wider, broader field of AI, which has been around actually for decades. So this is not actually anything that's generally new. Right now, we have to ask the question of what is it good for when things perceive their environment, when they take actions, when they try to achieve a goal. Is that useful for us? What kind of problems can it solve? I quite hear AI talked a lot these days, only referring to a model. The reality is AI is part of a much larger system. Like any other iceberg, sometimes you're only seeing the top. I frequently refer to people these days, to Monica Rigatti's data science and AI hierarchy of needs. AI is at the very top of this period. If you see all of this, you'll recognize so much of computation technology in here, which means that actually if any of you work in any of these pieces, you work in AI, so congratulations. Please start applying for the AI grants. So this can be hard for some folks to navigate, so I would just encourage you to really break this down into 3 parts. When we talk about AI, we're talking about data, we talk about software, and we talk about this new thing at the very top, models and weights. Models and weights, really, when you're looking at those to understand how they integrate into your business, it's just like any other system. I encourage people to think of models and weights as a starting point. For some folks, that's better for them to think of them as initial conditions. And you need to understand where that allows you to go, as well as for anything else that you pick up and bring back into your product. What are the business decisions that you can make, and how can you share those tools afterwards based on whatever you're bringing in? So you do need to look at the licenses, at the terms and conditions, and then talking to your lawyer cats is good, because sometimes what you can do with that changes over time. It's not as simple as the license change right now. Software is useful, so if you think of models and weights, software, data, software actually has well-established patterns. You can steal those from anybody else you want. It's called forking. It's not actually stealing. And then if you're talking about data, again, talk to your legal team before you start building any product off of any amount of data, even if it's your own. My last bit of encouragement there, knowing I'm very short on time, is going to be that open source and AI for your business really comes down to 3 questions, just like any other kind of business. Do you need to build it for yourself? Do you have the resources and the people to start pilot initiatives and try things out? Do you need to buy it? Because you have to make trade-offs between your bottom line and what you can justify maintaining over time. Do you need to hire? Can you have your best interests and your core capacity for your business to be able to build out capacity, and you can't get there from here yet? Same as it's always been. This should look very familiar. It's not changed. So with that, I guess I realize fantastic. If you only remember 4 things from my talk that was not quite about open source for the enterprise, but hopefully we talk about open source in business and of business, I would encourage you to remember that open and open source, it's the license. There's a lot of talk here about it's more than the license, but the license is a really important part. So open source licenses are not terms and conditions. They're licenses. Licenses are copyright. Copyright is not terms and conditions. Big important difference. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I encourage you to ask yours about that distinction. Managing open source in organizations requires very good expectation management practices, sometimes of your own. AI systems are not new. There are existing systems and business models to allow you to make reasonable decisions, regardless of the hype that goes around them. And also, please talk to your lawyer cat. They're very nice people. This is my last bit of one of the strengths of our community is the global community we create. So I encourage us to continue to join together in unity and reach out to your larger community conversation rather than trying to struggle on your own to swim. We're all in this raft together. Thank you.